Thank you all for being here today and to this session of the Transport Lab seminar. Let me start by acknowledging that this campus is situated on land that has as traditional and true owners the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Nicole Badstuber with us. She's a PhD from the University College London. She has a lot of experience both in the practitioner sector and in the academia in the UK and in Australia, and she's currently leading the transport integration planning team for the Aerotropolis in Western Sydney, and that's exactly what she's going to tell us about today. So without further ado, thank you very much for coming to talk to us today, Nicole, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So yes, I manage an integrated transport planning team for the Western Sydney Aerotropolis. So what is the Western Sydney Aerotropolis? Greater Sydney has a plan to build a new city out in Western Sydney. It will be the first new city in Australia in 100 years. And they're looking at having a population increase in Western Sydney of 2 to 3 million people by 2040. So what me and my team does is look at integrated planning, both the land use and the transport planning. But what we use are a lot of the other skills that fall under the transport planning umbrella. So that uses analysis, traffic modeling, and engineering to come up with solutions that work both as a placemaking and for a transport outcome. So you're not working. So acknowledging the people of Western Sydney, we would like to pay our respects to the three Aboriginal groups that hold custodial duties for the Aerotropolis, the Darug, the Darawal and the Gundungurra. We extend our respects to the elders past and present and the many others who hold custodial obligations to country and have been connected to this place for many generations. We want to create a place that acknowledges and respects the vibrant and diverse Aboriginal people and that call Western Sydney home and have so for many generations. So briefly, my name is obviously Nicole Badstuber, but before I joined the New South Wales government around a year ago, I worked for an engineering consultancy. So I've worked in the private sector. I've also worked in a think tank, which was my first job coming here to Sydney. I worked for an urban think tank called the Committee for Sydney. And before that, in the UK, before I got sort of stranded here a bit with COVID, I worked in academic research and policy advice. So I worked at a few different universities in London, including University College London and the University of Westminster that has its transport programme, but also at the University of Cambridge and the London School of Economics, working on lots of different projects covering different modes. And so that's given me a really good foundation to do this role where we're trying to integrate all of the modes and create a more seamless network for Western Sydney. So you'll be able to see here called out in blue, which is where the Western Sydney Airport will be and the area that my team covers. You can see it is quite far away from the CBD that we're in at the moment. But it does have those opportunities to connect to some of the metropolitan centres in Western Sydney, which are Penrith to the north, Fairfield to the east, Liverpool within the blue area, and then Camden to the south. So what I do in my day-to-day job is apply the transport planning knowledge I have from working in universities, but also doing a course like your own, as well as collaborating with subject matter experts, whether they be on modelling or project basis, so that we can make evidence-informed decisions and analysis-informed decisions. So lots to go through here, but I will talk from the top down around the 12 o'clock mark. So the overarching aim really is that we create an integrated network, and core pillars to what we're doing in the most immediate term is that it's safe and reliable. So we have a program that is specifically looking at safety and access improvements that can be actioned within the next 2 years. But there is a larger vision here, which is in the next 30 years to create a multimodal integrated network. So if we look at the image, you can see in the front there the greater priority for active transport and placemaking, but in the distance also the airport and those buses. There is a whole bus network plan for Western Sydney and the metro station on your left. So we want to create this integrated network because we want to do what transport's there to do, which is connect people to where they need to go, but importantly also have better access to jobs and education. In Western Sydney, a lot of people are commuting east every day, and so we want to look at how can we create a network that connects to these new job attractors that are being built in Western Sydney, one of which is the airport, the other is Bradfield City Centre, where a lot of innovation is planned to happen, and there will also be its own residential area. So this is all to create access for Australia's first new city in 100 years, and so that people have travel choices. So we're building this, it's a greenfield development. It's fairly unusual for most of the transport planning that is done. Usually we do that where there's already people using some public transport. And so it's really important at this stage to plan for public transport services, because once people get used to their daily commute or how they travel around, they're not going to easily switch. And so we have plans in place to have bus services run before the airport opens and before Bradfield City Centre opens, and so that people can make decisions about where they're going to live with more confidence that they don't only have to rely on their private vehicle. A really important consideration in Western Sydney, and something that is a stronger factor than in other places, even in Greater Sydney or lots of other urban planning, is freight. So in Western Sydney, we want to develop more access to industrial lands. In Sydney at the moment, there is a really low vacancy rate. That means that currently there's very little industrial land available. And because that isn't available, people are going to Melbourne or Brisbane to relocate their freight networks there. By opening up a connected freight network in Western Sydney, we can create better access to that global network, as well as services for Western Sydney and all the things that we all now rely on, in particular since COVID. And then I'll briefly just talk about how active transport and placemaking is really important. So we want to create a city, and the decisions that we make today are going to last for the next 50 years at least. So there is urgency to build a city and build a network that also allows people to actively travel, maybe not today, but in the future, because if we don't put that in today, it won't ever be put in. Transport for New South Wales has something called positive provisions. So any road upgrade that happens needs to have an active transport component as well, so that we are improving that network, in particular on those longer sections for big upgrades. So all of that factors in a lot of the decision making that we make every day. So there's 3 pillars: that city shaping and precinct making, so all around actually creating a place. That means, for example, not just building huge arterial roads, but considering the function of the new places that are being created. We want to create services that do provide an excellent service to the community, whether they are commuting there for work or they live there and commuting or traveling to meet friends and family and want access to other services and opportunities. But as mentioned with the freight, a big driver for Western Sydney is also the economic growth and the impacts that a good public transport as well as a good freight network can have on facilitating that. So we want to connect the new airport, which will have a lot of air freight, to the wider freight network, and that will in turn enable the rest of west of Western Sydney, but also Greater Sydney at large to benefit from that. And ultimately, that economic growth is also there to help with that imbalance of where jobs aren't in Western Sydney, so that we can locate jobs closer to where people live, which means they don't have to travel as much. And that has lots of well-being impacts as well as the economic impacts. So here's a map. So if you remember the blue shaded area on the second slide, so the green outline is that blue shaded area. So you can see in the middle, that's the airport, which is being built by the federal government. So that's all federal lands. And then around it are various precincts. So up here is the Memory Road precinct. That's really important at the moment because it's seen a lot of accelerated growth, high uptake in the rezoning that's happened along this corridor. But there are also, down here is the Aerotropolis Core Precinct, which is where the new Bradfield City Centre will be. So that Bradfield City Centre and the airport are connected via a metro line that's being currently built all the way up to St Mary's. It's about a 20-minute journey, and St Mary's is one of the T1 stations, so provides connectivity straight into the city. So that experience will be very similar to the metro experience you might have if you get on at Central to Waterloo, or all the way down to Sydenham and up to the northwest. So it will be a frequent, reliable service. In addition to that, other public transport that is planned is new bus services that will connect to Liverpool, as well as up to Penrith and down to Camden and Campbelltown. And what is shown in the blue is the new upgraded roads. So there's going to be a new road here that will unlock a lot of development along the new corridor, but also provides relief to an existing small road, which is currently going through airport land. So to paint you a picture in Western Sydney, currently what are these big blue lines are just one single lane in each direction rural roads. And we need to transform that into somewhere that is going to have high freight traffic and also connect to the new city. So it's going to be a huge transformation from where we are, and we're doing that in an incremental way. One other thing to call out, just a part of the freight discussion, is up here. There is a new rail connection planned for what we call an intermodal, so where rail can connect with the road network in Western Sydney and then also down to the new airport. So that will shift a lot of freight that's currently on the road onto rail, and that will also increase capacity for other vehicles. Right, so don't worry, I know there's a lot on that image, but we'll go through some more of it and explain why certain things are being done. So there are 8 broad objectives as part of the 30-year vision looking out to 2050 and 2060. So as I frame this conversation, connection to country is really important. We want to acknowledge the generations that have lived in Western Sydney, as well as the Aboriginal people that currently call Western Sydney home. So that frames a continuous stream of work across the different projects, so that itself is also integrated. We want to, and that is my team's particular focus, is create a more seamless travel experience between modes, because as I mentioned earlier, what we want to achieve is people to not just depend on their own private motor vehicle, and we want to put the network in place so that people who move into Western Sydney don't do so. The airport will also be a critical part in encouraging public transport use to Western Sydney, and we work in partnership with other government agencies. So we work with the Department for Planning, Housing and Infrastructure, as well as Infrastructure New South Wales. They are a body in the New South Wales government that reviews a lot of the infrastructure business cases that come through and has that look across the different infrastructure types to make recommendations to government as to what is needed. So if you recall that image earlier, there's obviously a lot of road connectivity that is needed to kickstart the construction as well as the development of this new city. But there's also other infrastructure that is needed. So water and wastewater connectivity is currently a barrier to some of the developments going ahead. And we work with the Department for Planning and Infrastructure New South Wales on some of those challenges. There is, at the moment, quite a large direction from government to prioritise how we can unlock more housing across Sydney. And so this is also part of the discussion that we have with the Department for Planning, Housing and Infrastructure. Originally, the main objective of the development of Western Sydney was to meet that demand for industrial lands, as well as provide that freight connectivity. With that focus both in government and with that priority for housing, we are now looking at how there might be opportunities for more housing to be unlocked in the city centre in particular. So we work a lot across the other governments, but also in partnership with external stakeholders. So the airport is one of them. It's a developer of the airport, as well as a lot of the developers that are developing lands around the area. And that allows us to understand how developments are accelerating in the area, or what developments are being sequenced when, and that helps being agile around how we advocate for different infrastructure. So we have a 30-year plan, but we do have to constantly adapt to where we see pressure points. So all of that is to provide a good transport network, but not being forgetting that we're also impacting the environment in Western Sydney. So in particular, some of the waterlands and the creeks, and we need to be very sensitive around that. So moving on from that long list, here just a visualization of some of the staging. So at Transport for New South Wales, we talk a lot about the time horizons of 26, 31, 36, and that's often really structured around the modelling that is done. Those are the time horizons that modelling is done for every 5 years on the first and the 6th year. So looking out to 2031, another reason we look at that time horizon is that it broadly takes around 8 years for a road upgrade to happen, or a new road to be constructed. So the discussions we're having today are all about what will be there in 2031 when we're talking about those bigger upgrades. There are smaller upgrades that we can make, and so that is the safety and access program that we are currently progressing. And that is around what smaller changes can be made, such as intersection design, so that it can be safer whilst we wait for those bigger investment decisions and infrastructure upgrades. As part of 31, we're also looking at how we will stage the bus network. So I said earlier that we want to have bus services run before the day one of the opening of the airport, but also day one of the new city centre. And then there are discussions beyond the 2031 horizon, and they are a lot of business case development and planning out under different investment and forecasting scenarios. So we look at whether the transport has something called common planning assumptions. So that is an agreed forecast for different time horizons. It's based on demographic data from the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure, and it forecasts where growth is going to happen. That impacts the modelling, because based on where the growth is going to happen, there's going to be more demand. And we have to constantly update that, but also make some of those decisions now. So we are funding business cases, for example, so that investment decisions can be made out into the 2050s. So here are some of the wins recently. So what my team has been working on is taking that precinct level view, where we can look at all of the projects that are being worked on at the moment and advise how we would advise on what infrastructure to invest in at the precinct level. So of course, people are very committed to the projects that they're working on, but what we try and do is say, well, we can see, for example, from the modelling that this area is going to grow a lot more. We can see from what we're tracking about developer applications that this area is growing. And so with that in mind, under different funding envelopes, here's the options that we propose. So all of that was taking place between around November and March, and some of the wins that were achieved are the funding allocations that you can see on the screen now. So the big one really was Mamre Road. So Mamre Road is where we're seeing really highly accelerated uptake of development lands. It is another road that at the moment is just one lane in each direction, very narrow, and doesn't meet the demands of the freight vehicles traveling through it, as well as the construction vehicles traveling through it. Another issue that with all of this construction is happening is around the deterioration of the roads as it is being constructed. So that has had safety impacts, and that developer uptake as well as the safety impacts have been the key determinants in winning some of this funding. So half of the funding comes from federal government, $500 million, and the same from state. That's the sort of match funding arrangement that exists for a lot of big infrastructure projects. There's also some funding that was given for this red line, which is Elizabeth Drive, but that is more focused on the priority areas where there are road safety concerns. So an example of where we might not have followed the original 30-year vision, but adapted to some of the changes that we're observing, as well as the fiscal environment of government. So at the moment, government is paying higher debt servicing because interest rates have gone up for everyone, including government. And that means that difficult decisions need to be made about what was originally planned to be funded and what is now going to be funded. So that's the fiscal environment that we work in, and why this team works on some of those precinct level investment decisions and that advice, so that we can still make sure the road network is safe, but not overspend given the demands that we have. So the other elements that have funding are what you can see in orange, and this other shade of orange down here, and they are around planning. So as I was mentioning earlier, you know, once we get the investment decision, the road can be there in a few years, but we need to be making those arguments. And there are multiple stages that a transport project goes through. And so there's a strategic business case and there's a final business case. And only after that and multiple rounds of scrutiny by other departments such as Infrastructure New South Wales. And in this case, because it has funding from the federal government, its equivalent called Infrastructure Australia, only then can an investment decision be made. So if we want some of these corridors in the future, we need to start to make the case today. This orange element is the new connection that is planned on the eastern side of the airport and would replace this road that you can see going up, which will be closed by the airport as it starts to expand. And then the other one, so that will be a road upgrade, new road construction, and it will allow development all along here to take place because there currently is no road connectivity. The other project that has funding for the planning stage is down here. So you can see that this new metro stop, which is in Bradfield City Centre, will currently be the terminus of the line. And this project is investigating whether we might extend that line or provide other rail connectivity to it. So we say it's mode agnostic, even though it's both rail, but it's either going to be metro or rail, and that is part of what is currently being investigated. So that is another example of that long-term funding horizon and those long-term decisions that need to be made. And finally, what are we going to do in the shorter term? So in the shorter term, we're going to have bus services, and a big win here has been this green connection. So in the last budget last year, we didn't get funding for infrastructure, so just for the operations of the service. And that matters because you might know you need to have the buses be in a depot and be maintained and serviced. And currently there is no depot near any of this. So the bus services will be doing a lot of what we call dead running, which is when we run services without any passengers, they come at a cost and we're not providing any access to those people. So it's not a great outcome. And we're also looking at having electric buses on this new network, and they'll need their own depot. So the win there was that we can start looking at how to provide some of the key infrastructure for bus services. So This slide is just to briefly give you some of that context of the planning and the immediate and how we work with stakeholders to achieve that for freight. So some of what is in the works already are upgrades to the east-west connections around the Western Sydney Metropolis. But there are other investments that are needed. So Memory Road provides a east-south, north-south and east-west connection, so that in a diagonal, but it needs complementary investments to be successful as a freight network, because currently it doesn't have that connectivity. So some of the work that is being done is looking at how we can move freight onto rail, especially in Western Sydney, and build those freight lines for it, as well as intermodal terminals, which are a bit like a railway station, but just for freight rather than passengers. And then how we can create that connectivity on the eastern side of the airport. And then what all of these plans and programs basically mean is that there's multiple work streams that we have with different government organizations to achieve that aim. So the freight policy one will look at how do we currently fund freight and what priority does it have it organizationally. The sector plan is where we work with Infrastructure New South Wales on having that cross-infrastructure view. And then we work with the Department of Planning on how we could stage development and the zoning of developments around the Aerotropolis based on the infrastructure that is available. And our component there is obviously the transport infrastructure. So all of that can only be achieved if we have good collaboration across government and an exchange of information. And I'm sure you can imagine that that often involves a lot of legal deliberation and how we can really achieve those outcomes when there are competing objectives between different organizations. And finally, just this working kind that might be something that comes up in your future work is where transport has a plan for a corridor, but it isn't funded. And so if a developer wants to go ahead and build along that corridor, they can do so because that plan already exists, and they can count the money that is spent for example, upgrading an intersection so that they can access their site better as contributions instead of having to make the payments that they have to make for government for general infrastructure improvements. So the team that I work in is called the Western Sydney Aerotropolis team, and it's actually a really innovative way that transport is currently trying to make this a focus area and something that brings together all of that coordination. So Transport for New South Wales has around 35,000 staff and up to 50,000 if you consider some of the contractors that work for Transport for New South Wales. You can imagine that there are strong divisions between the different modes as well as different project teams. Another way that organisation is divided is based on what stage of a project it might be. So one team might be looking at it when it's business case, then someone when they get to a concept stage, and then a different team takes that on. So what this team that I work in with Alex, who's sitting here in the front, is working across that and essentially coordinating so that we have a clear strategic vision and we can bring the right central decision makers together and that our engagement externally is coordinated. Because often what happens is external stakeholders will try and talk to lots of different people at transport and then are getting different answers. So we try and coordinate all of that, which isn't easy, but it has the impact that we can really focus on delivering that vision and make a strong case for investment. So I lead a much smaller team called the Integrated Transport Planning Team for Western Sydney Aerotropolis. And we are a multidisciplinary team. So I have land use planners, I have transport planners, and people with project management and trains experience. And what we do is really work on 4 key pillars to have impact and to deliver at that precinct level. So really to nudge away from just advocating for those individual projects. So the first component is master planning. So there is a new development pathway for the Western Sydney Aerotropolis. And that exists because it's such a big place where there really is, it is a pure greenfield development, which is very unusual. So the master planning process is a way that a property owner of a piece of land of over 100 hectares can basically create a new little place with its own road network and lot sizes. And we provide technical input to that decision making. On each of the different projects, there you'll have control groups and governance structures, and the way that my team has impact is to bring together some of the coordination around what is happening on one project to the other, but it is also holding those projects to account, so against the 30-year vision that we have, and trying to understand where we can make some of those cost savings or deliver based on what the current demand is or forecast demand. So we turn up, we bring our transport planning knowledge as well as our understanding of traffic engineering and modeling so that we can nudge those conversations to where they fit in the bigger vision. So the other one is modeling and analytics. Sorry. Right, so modeling and analytics is where we work with that team to really translate their technical knowledge into something that not lay people, but like the executive and the senior leadership can understand. And that's a two-way process. So one way is translating the questions that we are being asked by executive as to why are we investing in that? Do we really have demand for this corridor? Into a very specific scope for the modelers, because they need a lot of definition of what the boundaries of the work is. And then we also do that translation the other way around. So we will then translate, well, what does the output that we're getting from different models mean for the advice that we're giving? And how does it fit in with other factors that we know are important to the decision making? So one factor that is really important to decision making that isn't quantitative at all is around public opinion on things. So for example, if there is a project which there is a lot of outcry around and you have a very vocal MP, then that's often a really driving force as to why a project is seen to need to be delivered, even if a lot of the evidence base isn't suggesting that. And so we have to come to the table and balance all of those factors so that we can make decisions for a government that is elected and provide the technical advice and see how we can make it all work. And then finally, we're on the relationships. So for example, with the Department of Planning, we do a piece of analysis looking at what the road capacity is, how much development can go ahead, and we work with them to understand what they have in the system and do their analysis so we know whether we're on track or not. So lots of collaborating with people, lots of working with people, and that's essentially what this slide is really saying. And so we do that for different levels of the work with different groups. So for the Department of Planning, that will often be at the strategic level, but with the Department Infrastructure New South Wales, it will be at the project, business case and prioritisation level. BDA is a government developer essentially of, they used to be called the Western Parkland City Authority, and their remit was to attract investment into the Western Parkland City, which is essentially what the name was for all of Western Sydney, and kickstart development on the Bradfield City Centre. They've now been renamed Bradfield Development Authority because their focus and their remit has shrunk to the Bradfield development, but we work with them, for example, to negotiate whether roads in the new city will be bus accessible and what requirements they need to meet to have freight access. How are we going to balance active transport and placemaking demands with those wider network requirements? So for example, that there is a corridor out or that the bus can have a high frequency service along the corridor. So don't worry so much about the text, but basically this is a snapshot of what was the airport precinct plan. And that is a really high-level document that was developed with the Department for Planning. And you can see with the different colours that a lot of different zoning has happened around the aerotropolis. And so in addition to that rezoning, there was also a high-level vision for what the road network would be to support that development. So just for interest, the lighter purple is industrial lands and enterprise. You can see really that focus on industry in the Western Sydney aerotropolis. But if we go closer down to where the airport precinct is, oh, that doesn't reach that far. With the red, you can see that it's commercial as well as mixed residential. So the city is intended to be activated at the ground floor and then have residential above it, and to start being a city from when that residential is in place. What is interesting in this image and might stand out to you is that the yellow area in the west is essentially zoned as agribusiness, which means originally the intent of this area was that there would be farm to table logistics, so that there would be farming in the in the western section that would then go on a plane and be flown out to other locations where those products were in demand. That has changed a bit and gives you an indication of how this is an evolving area and an evolving precinct. And all of this is relevant to master planning because this rezoning required a network, and that network was set out in this document. But there was a mechanism for developers to change that network, and that is the master planning process. And the way that we have impact on the master planning process is to bring all the technical guidance and SME knowledge that we have to a process which was intended to be a co-design process. So say you have a developer and the developer wants to realign the road so that they can make better use of the plots of land, the property lots on their site. We would work with them on how that has good outcomes. So there'll be requirements, for example, at what angle intersections happen, but there are also guidance documents on what level of network granularity we have. So ideally we have a block size of at maximum 400 meters. So that means basically if you have if your entire city was just blocks instead of, you know, what it's like in the CBD, that between intersections, the distance wouldn't be more than 400 meters. So with these larger lots and that focus on industry, as well as a desire by developers to attract super lot operators, which would be some of the big logistics chains or someone like Amazon who really want a big center of over 100,000 square meters. There's conflict there, not conflict, there's challenges. There's competing objectives there between the guidance that Transport has set out and what the developer wants to do. And so this technical assurance panel was a process by which some of that could be coordinated and negotiated. Transport had representatives on that panel, and I advised them on following the review of some of the drafts of each of the master plans. If you're interested in that, there are two that have recently been endorsed and published. So one for Bradfield City Centre, and the other one is for a developer called Ingham's Property Group. You might be familiar with the name, which is a big chicken farmer out in Western Sydney, and then our property group, because all of this has been rezoned. A great example of bringing together land use planning and transport planning. So I'll leave this because we've broadly covered the different topics, but I just wanted to give you an indication that these different projects come through different stages, and there is a lot of technical work that goes into each. So I will just conclude really with the bus services. And those bus services are planned to connect to all the major strategic centres currently in Western Sydney. And you can see there an indicated high frequency between Bradfield City and the airport, what was considered to be both a residential and a job attractor. At the moment, we're also looking at what other complementary bus services, more local bus services could be provided to not just provide connectivity between centres, but to people who might live along those corridors. Great. Well, thank you very much for listening.
There are questions in the chat already, and I assume we also have questions in the room. Let me start merging a few questions from the chat, and then we take questions from here. So, yeah, one question was that there seems to be direct connections via highways, but not so direct connections via public transport, which would lead to greater times via public transport versus cars. So,
Yep.
And in the same topic, why not considering BRT to get to the airport? And a different question, but maybe you can cover if there is anything about a new agri-food market required for Western Sydney.
Yeah, so on the BRT, there is a rapid bus service planned for access to both Bradfield and the airport. So I probably didn't call that out very well, but this purple area that you can see is going to be a transit only, so public transport only connection, which will mean that that connectivity can't be made by a motor vehicle all the way from Liverpool to the airport or Bradfield City. And some of the bus services that are showed in the spider map are for that corridor. So it's currently being planned under a project called Liverpool to Airport Transit Corridor. That is the objective. It's been designated as a public transport and active transport priority corridor. But of course, there are, as I was mentioning, always other factors to consider, such as at the moment, this corridor is only a one-way in each lane road, and residents are interested in getting more capacity increase, a greater throughput of that vehicle. So those are just some of the competing demands, but a project called Transit Corridor is being planned for that, and the plan is for a connection here directly to the airport to minimize travel times, and provide that connectivity and that direct access. So bus priority along the corridor, if not buses being completely segregated from general traffic are some of the options being considered at the moment. Sorry, what was the second question?
The need for a new agri-food market in Western Sydney.
Yeah, so that was the vision of the agribusiness zoning. And there is a relocation of markets to Western Sydney. Not on the top of my head, but that is the plan. So it's part of what's being considered, but obviously developers own the land, and often that vision, there's changes to how the market has developed. When the Western Sydney Airport was originally planned, this is pre-COVID, and since then there's been a lot more growth in commercial, right? So your consumer goods rather than fresh produce.
Okay, thank you. There are more questions in the chat, but I would take questions for the room, and if we have more time in the end.
Just wondering if you have any intercity train connection plans for the Airtropolis, or potentially is there any even high-speed rail connections planned for Airtropolis?
At the moment, there's been no announcement about that, but there are efforts going on to investigate high-speed rail. So it's something that is being considered at a national level as well, federal level as well.
Also another thing is the planning team is wondering if the planning team is aware that the travel time between Airtropolis and existing CBD is really high. Is there any effort being made to shorten that travel time between existing CBD to Airtropolis?
Yeah, so the metro line will be 20 minutes from St Mary's. So this metro line here, all the way to the end is 20 minutes from St Mary's, which is on the T1 line. So that T1 line takes you straight into the city. Acknowledge that it is a lot further away than the current airport. But Sydney and Australia in general is quite unusual to have airports so close to the city. you know, I live in the other side of Redfern and I can get a cab to the airport currently, which in London, when I lived there, it would take you an hour and a half to get out to the airport. So it's more akin to that. Yeah, because the land was out there. Another consideration of where you put the airport is also you need fairly flat land, one that's not going to subside as well. Yeah, acknowledge it's much further than the current airport. Yeah.
Jen was,
Yeah, hi, Nicole. I'm
Hello.
from architecture, design and planning. Thank you. It's just blows my mind how piecemeal and difficult it is to get things through. So it's so good to get that background information to be reminded of it. But I'm really interested in the people who are going to live here. Do you know if any modelling or investigation has been done into the types of people they're hoping to attract as residential users? You know, you said between 2 and 3 million people, and that's by body. I'm thinking a baby born yesterday will still only be in year 8 at high school. Like that's not very far away.
No, it's not far
So
away.
do we know who's going to be living here? Are they new residents to Sydney? Are we expecting internal migration?
Yeah, so what we do know is that waves of immigration do move further and further west. So there is an expectation that it will be new migrants, but also people moving from currently closer to the CBD out west due to affordability of housing. It is expected that there will be families in the Bradfield city centre and facilities like childcare and schools are being planned for the new city. Yeah, but you know, it isn't always the case for when people they just build a new infrastructure and developers. So some of that thinking is happening. It is, yeah, there is a CSIRO building, which is the first building going on site. So they do want to attract sort of the knowledge workers and people who currently live further east to the west. Yeah.
And what's the density going to be like?
So quite high in the city centre, which is where the red area is.
Yeah.
So it's apartment living, yeah, not as dense as like maybe some of the apartment blocks here, but certainly multi-story, you know, 2 to 3 bedroom apartments. Yeah, with what you can see in green is all of the environment and greenlands that are planned along the new Bradfield city centre. So conscious of Western Sydney being particularly hot and there being few opportunities at the moment for outdoor experiences. So that is being planned in and not just in Bradfield city centre. So here, some of the developments that are happening here will have local centres and recreational facilities for people to travel to have some of those experiences that they can't currently have.
What happens when this falls over?
In what
So
way?
the airport doesn't attract as many flights as the proponents claim for decades.
Yep.
And developers don't want to build there, and the metro is pretty empty, and the buses are extremely empty. And then we have a recession and the buses are canceled and so on. What do we do? Are you planning for any alternative besides your imagined vision?
Yeah, we are. So, I mean, bus services are being staged that it will be responsive to the demand as well as wanting to provide service to attract people to the public transport network. There has been some rethinking in Bradfield city centre around focusing more on the residential rather than just the office and commercial spaces. Currently, it is seen as an opportunity where there was good public transport connectivity from the metro line that is being built. So
Metro line doesn't provide hardly any accessibility. There's nothing else on the metro line.
yeah, acknowledge that, but it is connecting to the T1 line and can go into the city. So
More than an hour from St. Mary's into the city.
yeah, lots of people from Western Sydney currently travel more than an hour to get to their places of employment. So, yeah. Sorry, what else could I add?
You have all of these very lovely plans for the next 50 years. but the future rarely turns out as the planners expected. So what kind of adaptations are you gonna have when the market says, oh, we want single family homes here, or, oh, we don't want to do anything here?
So I guess I can't speak to like what the government would do in those cases, but I can speak to the fact that we are constantly adapting the plans for the shorter term based on what we're observing. So for example, there has been greater uptake in development along Memory Road than was much expected. And there has been less uptake in around these areas around the Aerotropolis. So we do consider that and monitor it and do analysis to inform whether or not we should be going ahead with how that 30-year vision was planned. And that is why we have been prioritizing, for example, getting funding for Memory Road because of the road safety that is currently in place there, for the poor road safety, and adapted what probably under the plan a few years ago would have been other corridors to prioritize funding for. So yeah, some of those decisions are way beyond my decision-making power, but I can tell you that me and my team, we do use the data that we get and the analysis, as well as aligning that to our understanding of what the political landscape is so that we can achieve the investments where they are needed.
Another question for the room? Okay, so in the chat we
We had one. Go ahead.
Follow-up question on the population in Bradfield City.
Yes.
So I was wondering what sort of population is Bradfield trying to attract? Like, are they people do a lot of air traveling, or are they just like generally the same kind of group as Liverpool or Parramatta?
I'm not sure if it's a binary bit between the two, but it is just people who like to fly. You know, on average, incomes in Western Sydney are lower than in the further east you move. So it is envisaged that this investment will lead to job creation around the airport, around those freight precincts around the airport, but also in Bradfield city centre itself, with a commitment by government to put some of their knowledge workers in offices there. So a mix, yeah, it's not targeting any specific demographic, but acknowledging, yeah, that there are waves of immigration to Sydney, and yeah, we want to attract a mix.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
maybe the last question, which is from the chat, it's about the word integrations has come up a lot.
Yeah.
One person was wondering what type of integration is the government defining for this project? Is it across modes, across transport and land use, or across?
Yeah, so I probably used it a lot because it's used for different contexts as well. So in transport planning, what we want to achieve is integration across the modes as well as across projects. So we're integrating the modes, and then we're integrating the projects for that precinct level. But we also work with the Department of Planning and Infrastructure New South Wales so that we, you know, land use is the driver of transport. So we want to make sure we're putting the right land uses and the right infrastructure in place. So yeah, that's why I use it a lot, because it's on multiple levels.
Okay, so thank you all for coming, and thank you again, Nicole, for